Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing circadian clocks. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and we've seen now that the suprachiasmatic nuclei are involved in controlling the circadian rhythm of body temperature through their connections to the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. We've also seen that they're important in controlling the sleep-wake cycle. However, what we haven't yet seen is how they're important in controlling the circadian clocks in many peripheral cells. So many peripheral cells also have this transcriptional translational feedback loop that we have studied in mammalian cells. Okay, and their transcriptional translational feedback loops are all in synchrony with one another and in synchrony with the light-dark cycle, and it is the suprachiasmatic nuclei which keeps them all in synchrony with one another. I've discussed how if you just have a culture plate of cells, of human cells, those cells are not going to have all of their circadian oscillators in synchrony with one another. Okay? In addition, if you remove the suprachiasmatic nuclei from an animal, from a mammal, then what starts happening is all of the cells of the body lose the synchrony, basically, of their circadian clocks. Their circadian clocks are no longer going to all be in synchrony, and they're no longer going to be in synchrony with the light-dark cycle. So the suprachiasmatic nuclei are truly the master clock. They coordinate all the other clocks. Okay, now how do they do this? How do they communicate with all the other cells of the body which have one of these transcriptional translational feedback loops within them? And that's a lot of cells in the body. Okay, far more cells have it than don't have it. Okay, so for instance, the cells of the liver, the cells of the kidneys, the cells of the heart, all of these tissues, all of their cells have this transcriptional translational feedback loop. So how are these little structures, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, controlling all these other cells' circadian clocks? Okay, well, it's thought to be through humoral mechanisms. Okay, so it's thought that what happens is the suprachiasmatic nuclei control the levels of certain hormones within the blood. Okay, and we know that there are certain hormones in the blood, such as cortisol and melatonin, which show circadian oscillations. So it's thought that the suprachiasmatic nuclei control the levels of these hormones in the blood, and then the levels of these hormones in the blood tell peripheral cells with a circadian clock what time it should be running at. Okay, and then they synchronize their circadian clock with the humoral circadian rhythms, basically, that are being driven by the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which are, of course, in synchrony with the light-dark cycles. Okay, right. So, I mentioned two hormones then that potentially are involved in this function, although we don't know they are yet. We don't know the pathways by which they actually intervene at peripheral cells with those peripheral cells' circadian clocks. Okay. However, two major hormones which we know have circadian rhythms, i.e. the levels of them in the blood show a circadian oscillation, okay, are cortisol and melatonin. Okay, so what I want to discuss with you now is how these two hormones oscillate within the blood on a circadian basis, and I want to also discuss how it is that the suprachiasmatic nuclei drive this oscillation in their levels within the blood. Okay, right, so we'll start off with cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is a hormone that is released by the adrenal glands, okay, and it is the hormone that is released in very large amounts in response to stressful events, basically, and it plays a part in the stress response. However, if you are not being exposed to stressful circumstances, so let's say stressful circumstances are absent, then the levels of cortisol in the blood do oscillate on a 24-hour basis, okay, whether there's stressful events or not, basically. Okay, so let me firstly show you the graph of cortisol varying on a 24-hour basis, and then we'll talk about the HPA axis, which is the axis, the endocrine axis, which controls the release of cortisol by the adrenal gland. Okay, we'll discuss how at the top of the HPA axis is the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, and we'll discuss how the suprachiasmatic nuclei are then controlling the paraventricular nuclei to produce this circadian oscillation in cortisol level. Okay, so firstly let me show you cortisol level versus time. So once again, time axis here, 0 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, midday, 16, 20, 24. Okay, and basically cortisol level is another one of these graphs that we've seen before. Basically, its level is very low at midnight, okay, so during the night, and then its level will be going up, up, up in the morning, okay, reaching a sort of peak around midday, and then starting to tail back down in the afternoon and evening, okay, to the low level at midnight, basically. So this is the level of cortisol within the blood oscillating on a 24-hour time period, basically. Okay, right. So we now want to understand then how the suprachiasmatic nuclei are driving this oscillation in the level of cortisol within the blood. Okay, now to understand that, we need to understand the HPA axis, which is what controls the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. Okay, so what is the HPA axis? Okay, well, HPA stands for Hypothalamic Pituitary Adrenal Axis. So the H is for hypothalamic, okay? The P is then for pituitary, okay? And then the A is for adrenal. Okay, so basically this describes each of the tissues that is involved in this axis. So basically, if you want to release cortisol from the adrenal gland, you have to make the hypothalamus send a message to the pituitary, which then sends a message to the adrenal glands, which tells the adrenal glands to release the cortisol, basically. And that's what this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is all about. Okay, right. So let me now draw a picture of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland then, and then I'll be able to illustrate the HPA axis. Okay, so here is my hypothalamus drawn once again from the left-hand side. Okay, here is the left mammillary body. Okay, like so. Right, so we have the optic chiasm viewed from the side here. We have the anterior pituitary, which is going to be an incredibly important part of this. So I'll colour that in red here. Okay, now which portion of the hypothalamus is it then that tells the anterior pituitary to release a message which is going to go to the adrenal glands? Okay, well, it's a nucleus that we have seen, basically, or rather nuclei that we have seen. This is why when we were discussing the anatomy of the hypothalamus, I showed you the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, because we're going to now need them. So remember, the paraventricular nuclei sit above the anterior hypothalamic nuclei, okay, and medial to the lateral nuclei. So I want to now show them on this picture. Now obviously I'm only going to be able to show one of them because we're looking from the left hand side rather than from the front or from above now. Okay, so we're only going to be able to see the left hand one here. And really it should be hidden behind the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. However, I want to be able to show it, so I'm going to show it like so. But really you wouldn't be able to see it because the lateral hypothalamic nucleus will be covering it up. Okay, so this here, this is representing the left paraventricular nucleus. Okay, but of course the right paraventricular nucleus is going to be doing exactly the same thing as the left paraventricular nucleus. Okay, right. Now, these nuclei then, they are bunches of neurons, okay, and they are in charge of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, if they want cortisol to be released into the blood, they now are going to send a message to the pituitary gland. Okay, and specifically they're going to be sending a message to the anterior pituitary. Okay, so it's the anterior pituitary cells which can send messages to the adrenal glands to tell them to release cortisol, rather than the posterior pituitary. Okay, right, so we're interested in the anterior pituitary here. Okay, right. Now, the paraventricular nuclei then, the message that they send to cells in the anterior pituitary, which can then send a message to the adrenal glands, is not a neural message. Okay, so it's not the case that axons are going to come down into the anterior pituitary and synapse onto the cells of the anterior pituitary. Rather, the neurons in the paraventricular nuclei are going to be releasing a hormone known as corticotropin-releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system. So remember, the blood that is coming to the paraventricular nuclei, okay, it doesn't go straight back into the systemic venous system. Instead, what it's going to actually do is it's going to go down to the anterior pituitary, and then you're going to have new capillary beds in the anterior pituitary, okay? And then, after the blood has drained through the anterior pituitary, then it will go into the venous system, okay? So that's unusual. Usually, blood systems don't involve two capillary beds. It's unusual to have a capillary bed reconverging and then splitting up into another capillary bed at another site. Okay, so that's when that does occur. The link between the two capillary beds, which I'll just show here, is called a portal vein, basically. Okay, so this is the hypophyseal portal system. So hypophyseal, or rather hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland, basically. So this is the hypophyseal portal system here. Okay, right. So the neurons in the paraventricular nuclei then, they're going to be releasing this molecule, CRH, and I haven't yet told you what CRH stands for, so I'll do that now. CRH here, in orange, stands for corticotropin-releasing hormone. Okay, they're going to be releasing this molecule, corticotropin-releasing hormone, into the hypophyseal portal system. It's going to be making its way through the hypophyseal portal system down to the anterior pituitary, and in the anterior pituitary it's going to work on certain cells of the anterior pituitary. Okay, and the cells that it's going to work on are specifically called corticotrophs. Okay, and these are the cells which are receptive to corticotropin releasing hormone, and which can release a molecule which can then work on the adrenal gland and make it release cortisol, basically. Okay, so there are many different types of endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary that release many different hormones. Okay, the ones we're specifically interested in here are the corticotrophs, which respond to corticotropin releasing hormone released by the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, so this is this message coming from the paraventricular nuclei then that tells these special cells of the anterior pituitary to send a signal to the adrenal gland to tell it to release cortisol then. Okay, so the paraventricular nuclei send corticotropin releasing hormone down to the corticotrophs in the anterior pituitary. Okay, and then the corticotrophs, these special cells of the anterior pituitary, are then going to release into the blood a hormone called ACTH. Okay, so what now does this stand for? Okay, well this is the hormone that's going to go to the adrenal gland and tell the adrenal gland to release cortisol into the blood. Okay, and this hormone stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so adrenocortico, and then the T is for trophic hormone. So the A is adreno, the C is cortico, and the T is then for trophic. And then the H is for hormone. So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is going to be released into the blood by the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary. Okay? It's then going to go down and work on the adrenal glands and tell the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Now, once again, we need to study the adrenal glands in a bit more detail because it's a certain portion of the adrenal glands that respond to adrenocorticotropic hormone and release cortisol, not the entire adrenal gland. Okay, so this is a picture of an adrenal gland here, okay, and roughly the adrenal glands can be divided up into two main areas, okay. The cortex, which is the outer portion here, okay, so this is the adrenal cortex, and the medulla, which is this inner portion here, coloured in red. Now, of course, you have two adrenal glands, one sitting atop both of the kidneys, okay. Now, the medulla of the adrenal glands is involved in releasing adrenaline into the blood, okay, so adrenaline is released by the medulla. Steroid hormones, such as cortisol, are released by the cortex, okay. Now, the cortex can be further divided up into 3 different layers, so I'll do this now. So if this is the adrenal cortex, we can divide it up into 3 separate layers, okay. The most peripheral layer, the most outer layer, is what's called zona glomerulosa, okay, and that layer consists of cells which can release the steroid hormone aldosterone, which is important in body fluid regulation, okay, but these cells don't release cortisol, and they're not going to respond to ACTH that much. Okay, then underneath the zona glomerulosa, this layer in red, the middle layer of the adrenal cortex, this is the layer that we're going to be very interested in studying the HPA axis. This is what's called zona fasciculata, okay, and this is the layer which contains cells which can release cortisol into the blood in response to ACTH. Okay, so we'll be coming back to that layer in just a moment. Once I've just finished the cortex, I'll now talk about this final layer in yellow here, which is the most inner layer just before you get to the medulla, okay, and this is what's called zona reticularis. Okay, and the zona reticularis is involved in secreting sex steroids into the blood, okay, so things like testosterone and other sex steroids. Okay, right, so again, we're not interested in zona reticularis. The layer we're interested in is just zona fasciculata here. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which has been released by the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary, is now going to go into the blood, and it's going to have effects on the zona fasciculata cells of the adrenal glands. Okay, and it's going to induce these cells to now release the hormone cortisol. Okay, so that great elaborate system, that is what is meant by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, okay, the HPA axis. So if you want to elevate cortisol levels in the blood, you have to tell the paraventricular nucleus, to tell the anterior pituitary, to tell the zona fasciculata to release cortisol into the blood, basically. Okay, and we've seen all these intermediate hormones, which are the intermediate messengers, basically. Okay, right, so that's how we can drive the release of cortisol into the blood. Okay, so how now do the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus tell the paraventricular nucleus to release cortisol? Okay, and indeed that's exactly what they're going to do. So we've seen that cortisol level has this circadian oscillation here, where it's highest during the day and lowest at night. What does that look exactly like? Well, that looks like that graph that we had of the firing rate of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. The suprachiasmatic nuclei, to put them on here, are down here. Okay, so basically during the day their firing rate is higher, okay, and during the night their firing rate is lower, okay, and they have connections to the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, so during the day they will be sending more action potentials into the paraventricular nuclei, and during the night they will be sending fewer action potentials into the paraventricular nuclei, and this then controls the amount of corticotropin releasing hormone that the paraventricular nuclei release into the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, so quite simply that then controls how much cortisol you have in your blood. So basically, at night when the suprachiasmatic nuclei are firing at low rates, the paraventricular nuclei will be releasing low amounts of corticotropin releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary will then be releasing low amounts of ACTH, and therefore the zona fasciculata will be releasing low amounts of cortisol, hence why we have low amounts of cortisol. As we get towards midday, what will happen is the suprachiasmatic nuclei will be firing at a higher rate. They will therefore be causing the paraventricular nuclei to fire at a higher rate and release more corticotropin-releasing hormone. Okay, this will then trigger the corticotropes of the anterior pituitary to release more adrenocorticotrophic hormone into the blood. Okay, and that will then trigger the zona fasciculata to release more cortisol, hence why cortisol goes up. Okay, so you've got this circadian rhythm of cortisol level within the blood. Okay, now this we think could be communicating with the peripheral cells all over the body and helping to synchronize their circadian clocks with the circadian clocks of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. But that mechanism is still not known at present, but we think cortisol was probably very important in doing that. Okay, right. Now let's turn our attention to this other humoral mediator which shows a circadian oscillation, melatonin, which could also play a role in coordinating the circadian clocks of all of the peripheral cells of the body and synchronizing them with the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Okay, so let's now talk about melatonin then. So firstly, how does melatonin level vary on a circadian basis? Well, you might be expecting me now just to draw out the exact same picture we've seen so many times now, but in fact, it's not the same picture that we've seen so many times now. Okay, melatonin is effectively the complement of what we have seen now, similar to the BK channel expression in the suprachiasmatic nuclei neurons. Okay, right, so let's now have melatonin level. Melatonin is highest during the night, okay, and then it gets to its all-time lowest during the day, and then it will rise back up as we go back till midnight. Okay, right, so this is how melatonin level is going to oscillate on a 24-hour basis. It's highest in the night, and then it goes to its minimum value during the daytime, basically. Okay, so this is melatonin in orange here. Okay, so it's another hormone with a circadian oscillation, however, and therefore it could be communicating to other cells of the body what time of day it is. Moreover, more importantly, these two could be working together to try and tell cells what time of the day it is. So it's not necessary that it's one or the other. You could have multiple channels of communication between the suprachiasmatic nuclei and the peripheral cells. Okay, right. So how then does the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or nuclei rather, cause melatonin level to oscillate on this 24-hour basis? Okay, well, I told you when we were doing the anatomy discussion about the structure which releases melatonin into the blood. Okay, it's the pineal gland here, so that's the main job of the pineal gland, to produce this hormone, melatonin, which is put into the blood. Okay, and the main function of melatonin is believed to be in coordinating the circadian clocks of all of the peripheral cells. Okay. Right, so how then does the suprachiasmatic nuclei control the pineal gland? Well, obviously it's an inhibitory relationship, and we have found the connection between the suprachiasmatic nuclei and the pineal gland. It's a mess, however. It's a real nightmare of a pathway. It's a very indirect pathway. It goes down to the superior cervical ganglia, and then it comes back up through other mechanisms. Okay, so we're not going to actually go through the pathway, but there is a connection between the suprachiasmatic nuclei and the pineal gland cells, basically, a neural connection. Okay, so when the suprachiasmatic nuclei neurons are firing at a high level during the day, they actually end up inhibiting the pineal gland cells, basically, through this indirect inhibitory neural connection. Okay, and that's why the release of melatonin by the pineal gland cells is lowest during the day. On the opposite side, during the evening, when the suprachiasmatic nuclei are firing at their lowest rate, then their inhibition of the pineal gland cells will be at its lowest, okay, and therefore the pineal gland cells will be releasing melatonin at the highest rate into the blood, and that's why you get the high levels of melatonin during the night. Okay, right, so it's an inhibitory connection between the suprachiasmatic nuclei and the pineal gland, but again it's a neural connection, and then the pineal gland controls the level of this humoral hormone, melatonin, in the blood. Okay, and that could be another one of these ways by which the suprachiasmatic nuclei are coordinating all of the circadian clocks of the peripheral cells. Okay, right, so we will call it there for this video. What we're going to move on to in the next video now is we're going to show how this model that I have now finished presenting to you is incomplete, okay? Because red blood cells, a cell that has no nucleus, shows circadian oscillations. Okay, you might just say, well, why can't it be responding to these humoral circadian oscillations, so the oscillating levels of melatonin and cortisol in the blood, okay, and then having circadian oscillations based on those? Okay, well, if you take a red blood cell out of the body, the circadian oscillations continue, even though the oscillating levels of these hormones, melatonin and cortisol, continue. Okay, so it can't be just the oscillating circadian levels of these hormones in the blood that is triggering circadian rhythms within the red blood cells. They must have some sort of circadian clock of their own. Okay, however, they don't have a nucleus, so it cannot be the circadian clock system that we have now studied for mammals in so much detail. Okay, it must be a different type of circadian clock system that isn't a transcriptional translational feedback loop. Okay, and such circadian oscillators that do not rely on a transcriptional translational feedback loop are called post-translational oscillators, or PTOs, okay, because they involve proteins post-translation, okay, some sort of biochemical oscillation that is post-translational, okay, and we will, in the next video, study the main example of a post-translational oscillator that has been very well studied, which is the cyanobacterial circadian clock, and we'll use that as potentially an example of a post-translational oscillator, or in fact it is an example of a post-translational oscillator, and then we'll say red blood cells must contain something similar to this, basically. Okay, but we won't be able to actually discuss the circadian clock in red blood cells because that's still in its early days of being investigated. Okay, right, so that's in the next video.